Something which has become a contentious topic of debate in the last few years, the idea of price transparency for medicine prices. And we see um, one argument, which is medicine transparency is a panacea. It's going to help solve all our affordability issues. Another viewpoint, which is actually it can hurt affordability in many parts of the world and in developed countries as well. So Adrian will share some of his thoughts on price transparency. What does the literature tell us, and what does theory tell us, and can we have a viewpoint which isn't necessarily this is a panacea, but where it can work, where it can't. For those of you who are joining us through Blue Jeans, we will have an opportunity for you all to ask questions and send your questions through the chat. My colleague Julia Kaufman will be looking for your questions and will ask on your behalf. So with that, we ask Adrian to share with us your thoughts and insights on this issue of price transparency. Welcome again.
Thank you, Prashant, and thank you very much for the invitation. So I'm going to talk for about 40 minutes, and then hopefully we'll get challenges from your contributions, and we'll all come out better informed about some of these difficult questions. The title, Can Transparency Lower Prices and Improve Access to Pharmaceuticals? It Depends, is the title of a note that Calypso Chalkidu and I wrote for the Centre for Global Development, which is on the website. And I'm going to, in the next slide, show you some of the other relevant publications on which this presentation is based. But what I want to run through very quickly over the next 40 minutes is just to essentially say, well, which price are we talking about here? I want to address this question as to whether somehow transparency is a good thing in its own right, irrespective of what it does to help outcomes. I then want to make a distinction between the process by which prices are arrived at, as in the procurement arrangements, and the prices themselves, and what the literature tells us about those. I want to touch on this question of collusion, and whether if suppliers know what other people are charging in the market, that makes it easier for them to rig that market. And then the central question of whether price transparency improves outcomes, and make the distinction between the on-patent and the off-patent markets, and then some conclusions and recommendations. So, as I mentioned, the core piece paper on which this is based is on the left-hand side here. It's on the Centre for Global Development website. It's also on the OAG website. It's a paper that I wrote with my colleagues and with Calypso Chalkidu and colleagues at the Centre for Global Development, and that all fed into supporting work that was done for the Centre for Global Development working group, which published its report on global health procurement, that piece of work led by Rich and Silverman. A couple of other reports on the OAG website. One is an examination of the WHO technical report on the pricing of cancer medicines. And then here, very difficult to see, but a critique of work done by Andrew Hill and looking at whether you can estimate what prices would be based on an assessment of input prices. But I'm mainly going to concentrate on the report that we did for the Centre for Global Development. I'm also going to have one slide which touches on the recent 3 publications in January by authors linked to the WHO, which essentially explored or argued for price transparency as being both successful and useful, but also important in addressing issues of affordability. So, which price are we talking about? So I'm focusing on the prices paid by third-party payers. I will touch very briefly on some out-of-pocket payer issues. And talking about the price paid to manufacturers, again, I have one slide on distribution and wholesaling, but that's not the focus here. And I'm making a distinction between off-patent and on-patent medicines. And as I say, I will briefly touch on one of the issues that I think is important for patients paying out of pocket. So this question as to whether transparency is a good thing in its own right. Should we be open in what we do? Well, most of us may well feel that's a useful mechanism by which to guide our lives in varying degrees, depending on lots of issues about should we always tell the truth to our children or to our partners. Lots of interesting issues there for people to think about. But is that the debate we're having? Or are we saying that transparency is important because of the ends that it achieves? So are we talking about transparency as a good in its own right? Or are we talking about it as a means to an end? And what happens if there's a trade-off? That actually being transparent about prices means we end up with higher prices and less help gain for our budget. Is that a trade-off we're willing to make? So my point here is really we need to make this important distinction between whatever we think about transparency as a good in its own right, and think about what as an economist, which is essentially a normative judgment for us as individuals. Your views are just as valid, perhaps more valid than mine, and what we might think as economists about how we get better value from health and safety. So, next crucial distinction I want to make is between transparency of the procurement process and transparency of the prices that come out of that procurement process. By process transparency, I don't just mean the rules, or I include not just the rules that aim to prevent opaque and discretionary procurement activities, but also what you do about at various rounds of the procurement process about giving information out about who's been successful at various. So a number of issues around process transparency. The first one is about reducing corruption, and this is evidence. And again, all of the papers that I'm referencing here are in the working paper that I mentioned at the start. So evidence that opening the procurement process does reduce the levels of corruption. Is an example from a study conducted with Buenos Aires. Different types of corruption. So we can be talking about where a supplier pays a bribe, which means that they get preferential treatment or guaranteed to win the bid. Or we can be talking about where all the bidders are essentially charged a levy by one of the officials. They have different economic impacts. I'm not going to go into those at this point, but there's some very nice work by the OECD that talks about these. And as you can see from this estimate, Oriel 2006, now quite old, but potentially corruption can lead to quite a significant loss in the benefits of global procurement spending. So the second aspect of process transparency is about increasing competition. And this process, effectively, you're less likely as a supplier to enter a process where it's very hard to understand how you're going to be judged, at what point you're going to be judged, and who is competing, and what's going to happen to the person who already has a contract or who knows the market better than you. And there's one paper here we cite about bidder qualification process in Japan, enhancing competition and reducing government expenditure. Suppliers being more aggressively under a transparent process than a discretionary one. A famous paper looking at the role of auctions in improving transparency. And a couple of papers that look at e-procurement and how that has increases. So one potential way to go back and say, well, is truly price transparency can help us tackle corruption as well, because if you know what the prices are, you can essentially assess whether, for example, the lowest bidder has been given a contract. But again, we come back to what are our trade-offs here? Price transparency is linking markets in a way that I'm going to talk about later, which means that some suppliers will be less willing to offer low prices because it has implications for what happens in other markets. Then there's likely to be a trade-off between price transparency and reduction in corruption. That doesn't mean that reducing corruption isn't important, but what it suggests is that if there are ways of reducing corruption through process transparency and through audit, then that's likely to be a more sensible route forward, and in a sense separate the question as to whether disclosure of prices is important to the process. So I've talked then about how process transparency can make it easier for people to bid. It means we're more likely to have bidders, let's say, from outside a particular jurisdiction. New bidders are more likely to enter. It can help us deal with corruption. But there can be a potential downside from disclosing too much information in the process. Organising the process is likely to be costly, but on the other hand, if we're talking about significant repeat processes, then it's likely that the cost will be outweighed by the benefits. There is an issue around non-standard complex transactions, where some sort of discussion and negotiation may actually be important to enable the bidder to understand exactly what it is that they are supposed to be bidding for. So it's less likely to result in low quality performance on non-viable bids. People actually have a better understanding of what they're getting themselves into. There are other issues around if quality is very difficult to verify, then during the process of the bid, then auctions provide very high-powered incentives for price reduction. So we get low prices, but we don't know if we're losing quality as a consequence of those prices if we're not able to understand quality that we're going to get. The optimal degree of process transparency is not clear. What is clear, I think, though, is that some process transparency, all the literature suggests, is extremely important and extremely effective in increasing competition. So I want to turn to this question of transparency and collusion. Sorry, I'm just trying to get to the full slide. So the transparency and collusion research is a little difficult to read on the screen, so we can make that. Okay. That's fine. All right. So apologies for turning away. So this question of transparency and collusion. So the extent of revelation of information during the auction alters bidders' buying behaviour, and likewise a revelation of information afterwards. So even if I don't know how much you bid during the process, if it's a repeat bid and I know what you bid after the event because that's disclosed, you've won that, then effectively that influences my bidding behaviour for the next round. And this is something that modern industrial economics, industrial organisation theory spends some time talking about. I've got on this slide and the next one just some quotes. Again, I mentioned a lot of interesting economic and practical work from the OECD on this question of public procurement. And their concern here in this 2008 report, disclosing information, for example, on who's bidding and the terms of the bid, would enable, if there's a group of suppliers who are trying to rig the process, then their ability to manage that process is increased if the bidder is if the process tells people who is bidding and at what stage they've got to in various ways. And if prices are disclosed, are fully transparent, firms have more tools to maintain collusion. The famous work by Stigler in 1964 argued that collusive agreements are more likely than homogeneous commodities, but will break down if price occurs as secret or unobservable. I will come back to this point because, of course, when we're talking about off-patent products, particularly generics, then of course they're extremely homogeneous. That's the whole point, that we can substitute one manufacturer for another. And that then in part represents conditions in which it's easier to have collusive agreements. So the second point on transparency and collusion is the existence of confidential discounts which make list prices unreliable. And so if we have confidential discounts and I'm the supplier and we're trying to rig the market I can't see what's going on. I can't tell what you bid. So the confidential discounts make it harder to have the solution. And there's a 2010 report which again goes through the points. Principle of transparency is of critical importance of preventing corruption, but transparency can be inconsistent with the need to ensure maximum competition. So avoiding unnecessary dissemination of commercially sensitive information. But transparency can also make a procurement procedure predictable, which can further assist solutions. So we're trying to get to a process whereby we get the advantages of process transparency. We get more bidders, we get a focus on price competition, provided we can, we're comfortable about quality, but not so much disclosure that we're effectively enabling people to collude or significantly change their behaviour in the next round of bidding. And one particular case is a famous case is 1993 Danish concrete market. It's a classic in the IO literature where effectively the Danish Antitrust Authority in 3 regions decided to publish prices, and in the other regions they were not published. Let's leave aside why that happened, but what happened within a year is prices had gone up by 20% and they'd also converged. So a predictable response from being able to see what's going on, everybody ends up bidding closer to each other and they end up bidding higher prices than before. And a couple of other papers which take more theoretical grounds, but I just put in the bottom here when US price fixing litigation on conspiracy claims in US generic industry, which you're probably all aware of from last year, which is grinding through the US legal processes at the moment. So this is a highly relevant example from the US generic industry where there's a major price fixing litigation going on at the moment. So I've talked then about process transparency. It seems to me the literature is unambiguous. It's a good thing, but we need to, in a sense, to balance how much information is disclosed within the process. So the case for price transparency per se, I'm going to go through a couple of arguments. Initially, the arguments that are made by Simone Vogler and her colleagues. I say the Austrian school, but not the Austrian school in the form that most economists would think about it. And they've made the arguments that if you know what prices are, it helps you understand, if you know what other people are paying, how good your procurement process is, which clearly has to be true. But the second more important issue is as an input to that process. So knowing what other people has paid helps you somehow to negotiate a better deal. And they essentially argue that confidential discounts as a way to achieve price discrimination and patient access cause an external negative externality, because it means that other countries can't see what's going on, so it's harder for them to negotiate. So in a sense, they turn the arguments around and say, if I can't see what discounts you're getting, then it's harder for me to get a good deal. And they talk about, in a sense, there's an imbalance because I know I'm supplier A, I know what I'm charging in all these countries, but somehow the buyer is not allowed to know what I'm charging in other countries. Of course, there's an asymmetry here, because if I'm the buyer, I don't know what you're charging in another country, but I do know what all your competitors are charging me, and you don't. So, and this is interesting, again, in lots of high-income countries where you have lots of outcomes-based schemes, discounts of various sorts, and you have subsequent entrants coming in, and they don't actually know what prices are being charged by their competitors. The only people who know are the payers who organised all these. So in a sense, there is I think, an asymmetry in their assertion that it's somehow wrong because the buyer doesn't know what the supplier is charging in other markets. Yes, that's true, but the buyer knows what all of the competitors are charging, and the supplier does not. So we'll come on to, I think what's important here is that you need to separate on-patent innovative drugs and off-patent drugs where we have lots of different suppliers. So if you come on to the sort of economic efficiency argument, so and we move out of pharmaceuticals and think more generally, then being able to make price comparisons across markets helps us understand how well our competitive processes are. And they encourage us to understand how efficient those markets are, and we want them to be efficient in the economic jargon of static efficiency, which I'll come on to in a moment. And the European single market in the European Union is a classic example of where barriers are removed in order to promote competition, in order to reduce prices and give consumers a better deal. And the important thing about the European single market is, how does the Commission judge whether the single market is working? And the answer is, it looks at the degree of convergence of prices. And the European single market works extremely well in most areas because, as far as the Commission can see, there's more price convergence in Europe than there is in the US. So if you think about the US as being, in effect, a single market of sorts, if you look at lots of goods and services, there's a greater degree of price convergence in Europe than in the US. And the Commission takes that as an indication that essentially competition is working, people can move freely and sell in different parts of Europe, and so prices are moving down towards a cost of production plus a reasonable return. So the problem is, and this is the argument for static efficiency, then we're getting more competition. Prices are approaching cost. That means that as consumers, whether we're buying drugs or whatever we're buying, we're already spending the money that we have to in order to get these goods, and it means that we can then make decisions about what else we want to buy, whether it's a health budget or our personal budget. The problem with the innovative pharmaceutical industry and some other industries, broadcasting, Netflix, amongst others, is where you've got large fixed costs. In the innovative pharmaceutical industry, it's R&D costs. In other sectors, it might be different sorts of costs. Then, if you just charge manufacturing and distribution costs, you don't recover your R&D investment. So pricing equal to short-run marginal costs means that the companies are not able to get a return on research and development. So therefore, we have an issue about how do we recover the costs of R&D, and differential pricing based on Ramsey pricing has been the one approach that's been applied. So Ramsey optimal pricing initially applied to taxation. So governments need to raise revenue X in order to provide a public service. What's the most efficient way in which they can raise that money and tax people and distorts least economic activity? So it's the same principle. How do we recover R&D costs from global health systems in an efficient way that distorts as little as possible how much of the drug gets used by patients? And a paper that Patricia Danson and I wrote with a colleague from OHE, we argued, demonstrated that the best way, if you move beyond Ramsey pricing, the best way of recovering R&D cost is for health systems to have a willingness to pay that reflects how important health gain is to them and what alternatives they have for spending their healthcare dollars. So how much does a particular intervention give them in terms of health gain, and what else could they get if they spent that money on something else? But of course, price discrimination, as opposed to having different prices because countries have different willingness to pay for an on-patent medicine, there's going to be winners and losers. So some countries that are relatively well off, value health importantly, are going to end up paying higher prices than countries that are in the opposite. So one issue is whether countries facing relatively high prices, making significant contributions to R&D, are comfortable with that, or whether they want to push back. So if we move on to off-patent medicines, then we don't have recovery of R&D. That's already happened, or at least the patent has expired, and that's all the time that the innovator gets to get a reward. So improving static efficiency, getting prices down to costs, manufacturing plus distribution, should maximise social welfare, as in it should enable health systems to buy as many generics as they need or can usefully use, again, given other things that they can spend more money on. But there are two provisos. Sorry, price transparency in this context would seem to be something that will help health systems and out-of-pocket patient purchases ensure that they're getting a good deal. There's no need, in a sense, to find some way of recovering R&D costs. And there are two provisos. One is the need to avoid pollution, which we've talked about, which I'll come back to. And the second is the issue of unobserved quality. So a particular problem with out-of-pocket purchases is if I don't trust the national regulator, I don't believe that they actually inspect factories and close them down if the medicines are substandard. I don't actually know that I'm getting the ingredients that I need. And I may well, with price disclosure, take the opposite view. The more expensive is the medicine, the more I'm likely to buy and prefer that one, because the cheapest one probably is cheap because the quality is awful. So we may well be in a position in markets with very poor, low-quality regulatory systems where price transparency is helpful to the customer, but in the opposite way. It becomes a signal of quality. And of course, that's one of the bases on which the innovative industry has maintained markets in middle-income countries, because people want the off-patent brand from the innovator and because they don't trust the local generic companies. So, next issue I want to turn to then, so we talked a bit about the economics and some of the arguments that have been raised around the benefits of price transparency, and then I touched on some of the R&D and how we recover R&D costs and separated from the on-patent medicines and the off-patent medicines. What I want to do now in the next couple of slides is try and separate and distinguish between bargaining power and price transparency. To what extent are those linked, and to what extent are they actually separate, and we need to concentrate on one rather than the other. So, critical point, price transparency is linking markets. So, if I'm a supplier, I'm supplying A and B, and I know that IRA will insist on paying the same or a better price, or a lower price than that paid by B, then I adjust what I offer B accordingly, because I know that's going to, the markets are linked. That influences what A will be willing to pay. If B is much poorer, then it may be that I simply don't supply B. Rather than cutting my price to A is such a level that B can still afford to use the product, I simply exit from B and concentrate on selling to market A. The optimal solution is to supply both A and B, but at different prices, certainly in the interests of B, who otherwise may not, will either face a higher price or not get any supplies at all. And pointed on the third bullet, fourth bullet, the supplier is likely to delay launch or not launch at all. And B, that means, and they're not going to get the price that they want in country A. There's another, I think, important point in thinking about payer bargaining power, which needs to be borne in mind, which is if high-income countries are very successful in keeping down prices, then there's an issue about the signals they're sending about how much R&D they want. So if I'm in country X, if I'm willing to pay, for the sake of argument, let's take the UK, £30,000 for a quality-adjusted life year, if that reflects the underlying preferences of citizens, that's fine. If actually citizens would rather pay, for the sake of argument, £60,000 per quality-adjusted life year, then what we're doing in the UK is sending less signals about how much we value R&D than reflects our underlying preferences of our citizens to have health rather than other things. So there is a dynamic aspect to this in terms of a country, in a sense, artificially suppressing how much they want to pay or how much they value health gain. In the short run, budgets go further. In the longer run, less R&D and fewer new products and health gain as a consequence. So, second point, just to build on this bargaining power issue. And again, we're sticking with the on-patent medicines here. So, let's suppose that buyer A and B now combine forces. So there's a bigger volume, and if I'm the supplier, I have to take A and B together. They're not separable. They are jointly procuring from them. Then the price is likely to be lower than in market A. Now, of course, it's possible if there's significant differences between A and B in terms of their wealth, their income, then B may still have got a better deal from separately negotiating with them. Because now the two markets are linked, albeit through combined procurement. It may be, of course, that B wasn't a particularly attractive market because it's too small, it's expensive to enter and maintain an infrastructure, and therefore I might have wanted to charge them quite a high price for this. So there's an open question there. But I think the key is that bargaining power coming from either purchasing large volumes or from not having any money. In other words, there's two reasons why somebody might give you a good deal. One is because you're buying an awful lot from them, and the second is because they know you haven't got any more to put on the table. So if they charge you more, you just walk away. And as long as they're getting a margin, then they're better off supplying you, providing they don't have to offer that price other people who do have more money. So PAHO is a very powerful, effective vaccine purchaser. So it's a very good example of what regional procurement can achieve in terms of getting a good deal and ensuring that country A and country B have access to vaccines. Open question, though, whether some countries, low-income countries, might get a better deal outside of PAHO if PAHO didn't insist on the lowest price. In other words, if I'm a very small country that essentially doesn't have much money, but the price is linked to Argentina, Brazil, and various other middle-income countries, then I'm going to price accordingly.
Or if you have so much volume like Brazil that you don't need PAHO to negotiate with the payer, right?
Yes. So I think the key point here is that PAHO is both a very powerful procurement machine, for want of a better way of putting it. They also insist on price transparency. I think the key point that I want to make here, it's not clear that the price transparency is particularly helpful to them. What matters is the procurement. That's what gets low prices. And it may be that PAHO gets low prices because of its bargaining power, in spite of price transparency, and not because of it. It's how much they buy that matters, not the fact that they then tell everyone what prices. So, I'm conscious of time, so I'm just going to mention very briefly the three papers that were published in the BMJ last month. So the first one was essentially looking at, or making an argument that price transparency and the WHO database have been extremely useful. The database has data from 150 countries, and four countries were known to be using it in price negotiation, which to me doesn't sound like a lot. Another three were using it to improve purchasing, but that seems to me to be a separate issue. These are important changes in procurement arrangements which are not linked to price transparency. Second paper, subheading there, improved transparency is essential to determine what is fair. And the point here is there's an absence of reliable data on development costs and no simple algorithm that will calculate a fair price for each medicine. And then the third paper essentially looked at what that fair price might be and argued it was somewhere between sustainable cost, including getting a return on R&D, and a maximum affordable price. Then it goes on to argue that costs may be discovered by prices under competitive market conditions. or estimated by experts. The paper I mentioned, where we look at some of Andrew Hill's estimates of generic prices, I think identify some of the issues when experts are trying to estimate what prices should be. But the critical point here is one way of estimating costs is by having competition. So, in other words, if we focus on competition and increasing competition in our procurement processes, then that's a way of identifying and by that I mean competition within therapeutic areas as well as multi-source competition when drugs come off patent. Talks about the need to allocate global R&D costs, incorporate value assessments into the price. So for me, that comes very close to what I was arguing before, the work we've done with Patricia Danson, where, in a sense, that the floor is a sustainable price that gives a return on R&D, and that the top end is the willingness to pay for health gain, given the other things you can spend your health budget on. That's the range. Or in our case, value-based differential pricing, I think in the paper that Prashant has just published, value-based tiered pricing. But I mean, essentially, that's the issue. So, what happens in the off-patent market? Well, we don't need to recover R&D. We don't need ex-manufacturer prices to vary by market, other than the cost of doing business within that market. So there's a much stronger case for price transparency. The only issue is trying to avoid collusion. So going back to the Stiegler paper, 1964 paper, about it's easier for suppliers of a homogeneous product to potentially collaborate. And then I come back to this quality issue, which I raised before. But the way in which we deal with the quality issue is by significant investment in improving the regulatory processes within middle and low-income countries. And I think various people have made those arguments. I think a number of donors, such as the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, have prioritised that as something that's extremely important. But one key way we get lower generic prices is by healthcare payers and patients who are buying out of pocket having confidence in the national regulatory processes that the quality of generics can be assured, and therefore they can buy on price. That's not the case, and that it's much harder. In a sense, the problem cannot be solved by price transparency. Indeed, the obvious behaviour is to keep away from the low-price product, because that's the one that's more likely to have lower quality. If you don't have confidence in your national regulatory authority and their policing medicines quality. So, question then in the generic market is price transparency should work, but this risk that we're increasing collusion. The problem here is that it enables colluders to observe deviant behaviour. So if suppliers have got together, then they can observe whether I've actually offered a lower price than we'd all agreed that we would do. So one route forward, which we put in the paper, was to have one-sided disclosure of multi-source prices. In other words, the buyers know what's being charged in other markets, but that information is not in the public domain, and so the suppliers do not know. So that seemed to us to be something that would offer increased competition, but it would be important to ensure no supplier access. Because obviously if some suppliers were able to obtain access, then it would influence how they behave. My one slide on distribution and retail markups, and we just considered whether transparency might help in this context, given the importance of people paying out of pocket in many retail pharmacies in many middle and low countries. And of course, our tentative conclusions for discussion were that transparency of markets will probably be helpful. There's a danger that leads to, in a sense, to collusion at the retail and at the wholesaler level. And also there's an issue where governments are contracting for distribution services. But I think on balance we thought it's quite important that governments understand what the nature of the add-on costs and margins is distribution and retail sector. So, final slide. Difficult to read, but these are the three conclusions on patent and the 4 conclusions on off patent from the report that were also in the note that Calypso and I did. So we don't recommend price transparency for on-patent medicines unless there's some sort of global purchasing agreement where we agree the US is 100, that Italy will be 75, and Malawi will be 15, or whatever it is. If we have that, then we can disclose prices, although the argument that the reason for price disclosure is to get lower prices then doesn't work. Differential pricing based on an assessment of value, countries' ability to pay, is important and can be best achieved via confidential discounts. And a critical point for us, payers ought to concentrate more on copying good assessment and procurement processes rather than trying to copy prices. And so in this context, one might think about the US, but we're not discussing the US healthcare system today, but we kind of feel with some of the proposals in there, it's almost, we don't like pharmaceutical prices in the US. We look over there at Italy, they seem to have lower prices. We've got no idea what they do. We don't care, but can we have those lower prices? Whereas actually, what we really ought to be thinking about is who's got good technology assessment processes or procurement processes? How do those work? How can we make those work in our healthcare system? Alternatively, if you have a number of nearby countries who have very similar income levels and similar health needs, then should we be thinking about pooled procurement as a way of exerting bargaining power to get lower prices? On the off patent, then transparency of processes is important. Price transparency for the products could improve market efficiency. We therefore recommended considering one-sided disclosure. And then the final point around our recommendation to consider price transparency around wholesale and retail. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Adrian. Thank you, Adrian. Time for questions, comments, remarks. People here in the room, people joining us through Blue Jeans. So why don't we start with anyone who's in Blue Jeans, and if Julia, you have any questions, let's start with that.
Question from someone watching online, which is the National Medical Supply Fund of Sudan electronic system sends all quotations to all bidders, and some suppliers argue that it's unfair to share their bids with their competitors. What do you think? Is the practice of the National Medical Supply Fund in Sudan breaching confidentiality?
Okay, I'm slightly reluctant to start kind of critiquing particular processes that I don't know the full system, as it were. But it seems to me that clearly it's a breach of confidentiality. But then, the obvious issue is it likely to lead to a better procurement process or not? And I think the danger there is first time around it's fine. I go to you and I say, well, X has bid this, either match it or you're not getting the business. But then on the assumption this is a repeat exercise, and so you're regularly procuring either different bundles of medicines or the contract gets renewed, then people are going to learn from the disclosures, and they're going to adjust their behaviour accordingly. So it seems to me that the transparency that should be in the process rather than disclosing prices.
Okay, questions here in the room. So while people are, sorry, go ahead.
Thank you very much. My name is Laura Dagner, and I'm the Director for Policy and Government Relations for Latin America in Merck. But all my colleagues, those that in different regions that have read this paper, we're very interested. I think is so far a very balanced approach that you have taken, because it's very common to basically blame everything to the prices that the innovators are charging, and there is a lot of inefficiencies going on, precisely as you point out, in the procurement processes, and that has not been in most cases the focus. So my question is, what is the next step on this, or what are you expecting from this exercise, from this paper? Are you taking this, to the WHO to be part of the discussion that is taking place? Because again, most of the efforts seem to be on price transparency, on our R&D costs, and many ideas, which I think is really harming the R&D processes. And antibiotics, by the way, is a great example of that issue that you pointed out, to willingness to pay. Many pharmaceutical companies are stepping off the R&D for new antibiotics. That's not the case of Merck, but many are. We are, experiencing a rise in antimicrobial resistance, and yet, this won't be solved by price transparency. It goes beyond that. Right? So I would like to know your next steps for this. Thank you.
Sure. I think Calypso and I talked about more formally responding to the three papers from the WHO team, and sort of hopefully taking that part of the debate forward. I have to say it can be a little difficult to engage with WHO on this issue, although I do think there are some interesting points in the papers that came out in January, particularly Suri Moon's and her colleagues' comments. But it does seem to me that there's two areas really. One is, I think, what WHO thinks, and that is extremely important. When I go and visit countries and talk to people, then what the WHO says actually matters. It has an impact on how they think about it. It doesn't mean they necessarily do everything the WHO says, but it's out there. But I think the other part of it is the work on global procurement and the sort of follow-up to DGD's work in that area, where we have very real practical issues. How are countries going to deal with their graduation from Gavi and other global procurement arrangements, and how are they going to organise their purchasing? So in a sense, I think that for me, there's two sort of potential areas. One is trying to engage with WHO, but I think the other is the nitty-gritty of some of the practical issues that middle and low-income countries face as they think about procurement arrangements, graduating from various donor teams.
Julia.
Another online question. I would appreciate some more critical reflection upon dynamic efficiency based upon sunken R&D costs. This is an argument used to validate excessive drug prices in order to recoup these costs. However, a larger proportion of revenue is actually spent on marketing and financialization, for example, stock buybacks and dividend payments to shareholders.
So I think here, in the sense that the question as to whether prices are higher in some countries than they need to be in order to generate dynamic efficiency. I mean, again, it comes back to what Patricia Danson and I have been arguing, and I put in the slide deck, is that health systems need to signal what they're willing to pay for health gain, and that needs to then be reflected in prices being at that level or lower than that level. So in a sense, for me, the issue is, what am I getting from this product? And I don't really care how much it costs to develop or how much they spend on marketing. I mean, I may want to regulate marketing for other reasons. I may want to have an impact on the information that is going to prescribers. But in a sense, what I'm interested in is not how much it costs the company to get there, but what I'm getting from what's in front of me. what is it going to do for the citizens that I'm trying to spend my money on improving their health status. But if those procurement arrangements are not in place, then clearly, in a sense, you've got two sides of a market where the buyer is not behaving sensibly and is not organised in a way to exercise their bargaining and to reflect the people that they're representing. In which case, they may well end up with higher prices. I mean, so it seems to me that the central issue is organising the buyer side rather than, in a sense, poking the suppliers and trying to say, well, how much did it really cost to make that? I think that for me, the issue of marketing expenditure is it's not what's being spent, but the issue is what sort of information do we want companies to supply on what basis, and then how much it costs them to do that is shouldn't. So.
A couple of questions, comments that I want to get us started with, and then that'll give us a chance for others to reflect and think. So the first, Adrian, is in many countries where public procurement law says if you are using taxpayer dollars for procuring something, the price that you paid in a contract under the Freedom of Information Act or some other legislation of this sort can eventually become public, even if the state agency in charge of purchasing isn't necessarily putting it out. So one of the things we've seen historically in the procurement at the Veteran Affairs procurement in the U.S. was the prices were put out publicly, but with a delay, with the assumption that many of the markets are very dynamic, especially for on-patent product, that you can meet both by delaying when you actually publish the prices paid. So any comments, remarks you have on that? So that's my first question, comment. The second is you mentioned pool procurement for off-patented products or generics. And I think one dynamic we've seen, and Greg might have other things to add to that, is if you're a very large pooled purchaser, then you get a price which is the best a given supplier can offer to you. But if you are a single purchaser, a low and middle income country who is doing all other things in their purchasing process right, which means paying on time, showing good due process and selecting, you may end up getting a price which is lower than what is given to the large pool purchaser. And also it's a matter of what incentives does it create for a low and middle income country to have the right processes in place for purchasing, if you only think about pool procurement as the mechanism for them to get lower prices. So any thoughts and reflections on that?
Okay. So the Freedom of Information legislation, it seems to me, in most countries, certainly in the UK, there are certain exemptions. So the UK National Health Service usually gets exemptions from disclosing confidential price discounts. But clearly that varies. But it seems to me that in most circumstances you would want your Freedom of Information Act to have some exemptions, because again, you're trying to achieve. You're seeing freedom of information as a means to an end. So if there are circumstances in which it stops you achieving your end, then you may want to exempt, at least temporarily, those things from the Freedom of Information Act. Brings me to my second point, which is delayed disclosure. So it seems to me, I'm not aware of literature on this, but it does seem to me that potentially delayed disclosure might be helpful with a suitable gap where you, in a sense, you've got some indication retrospectively of, if you like, how well am I doing in my procurement processes, but you're not disclosing information that's going to have a material impact on the way in which suppliers view your market. So potentially there's some sort of balancing act there, but I think having it almost as a retrospective justification of a Freedom of Information Act that may not be working properly isn't the right thing. I think the Veterans Administration, and again we're getting into US healthcare, but my sort of general understanding, and I may be wrong here, is that people elsewhere in the marketplace do not expect to be paying Veterans Administration. So in that sense, in a sense, it's a little bit like if there's agreement around the world that country A will pay 10% of what country B will pay, and country B is happy with that, then having the information in the public domain is fine. It doesn't alter anyone's behaviour. So it may be that the Veterans Administration sort of fits into that category. Your final point around a low-income country joining a pool procurement arrangement may actually end up with a higher price. I think this comes back to, even though they're doing everything right in terms of the rest of the procurement arrangements, comes back to one of the issues that's addressed in the Centre for Global Development report, which is what sort of countries should be pooling together. So ideally, there have to be significant similarities between the countries that make sense for them to be thinking about purchasing together. Otherwise, they will be in a situation in which some of those participants could in practice have got better deals by not being part of the procurement arrangement, which inevitably is going to put pressure on it. So I think the pool procurement arrangements need to be organised in a way, or the other way around. It's people who might expect on their own account, if they're purchasing efficiently, to be paying roughly similar prices, then they're likely to get a better deal if they are pooling their efforts and buying collectively and guaranteeing high volumes too.
And one quick comment about this is that the definition of welfare in what you're calling a static and dynamic efficiency is not including any other benefits such as more jobs, because if I leave the pool and buy bilaterally, the firm sets up a $1 billion manufacturing site with 500 jobs in it, which is also an economic benefit to me, not in the Ministry of Health, but in the larger industrial policy sense. So the efficiency definition is only focused on health, is not looking at other potential benefits, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So we come back to another delicate issue of industrial policy and when that becomes part of procurement. And there's always a great danger that if a bunch of buyers insist that a supplier sets up a factory in every market, then they can do that. They'll have jobs, but the prices will be higher because someone's got to pay for all these factories. So ultimately, something happens are supplied. So I think there is a challenge here. I think one needs to be careful about strategically how countries use industrial policy and what they're trying to. It is an extremely powerful tool, but we need to be careful that we don't end up pushing cost to your health, which means ultimately.
Yeah, we'll go to Elizabeth.
Thanks very much. I'm Elizabeth Gardner. I'm an independent consultant. I was interested in your comments about the costs and that not being as much of your focus. But I guess I'm curious then how you interpret the example of the HIV antiretroviral pricing that we had, I don't know, 20 odd years ago. I mean, clearly the costs were a factor in lowering the prices. So what is the role then of understanding the costs and using that to influence the price?
Well, I think so. If we have therapeutic competition, so let's suppose, for the sake of argument, keep it simple, all the products are on patent, but there are 4 or 5 suppliers. the hepatitis C market, then essentially you've got the ability to have competition in that environment. And the floor is going to the floor of the discounts you've obtained will be what's making this. So in that sense, competition will give you some information about cost levels as in the quote I took from the Nunatal paper. But the other key piece of information is when products come off patent, and then you get an understanding of what sorts of prices generic companies apply. But again, of course, you need competition. If you just have one generic company, it'll price 15% below the brand. You won't have much. You won't get much of the benefits of the patent expiry. So I would argue that the competition tells you a lot about what underlying costs are, and the more competition you generate, then closer prices are going to come underlying costs. So I don't think we should not be worried about what costs are and have some understanding of our competitive processes driving down costs. And to understand that, we need some sense of where we think costs should be. So, indeed, one of the things suppliers spend an awful lot of money on with consultants is trying to reverse engineer what they think their competitors' costs are and what their processes are. So I think having some understanding of costs is helpful. But for me, the main focus should be trying to use competition in order to get those prices closer to costs.
A couple of related questions. First is, to what extent have you given thought about regulating price transfer? A little bit with your about, well, what about making historical price information available? Is that a good alternative? Is that a good way of balancing cost and benefits of price information? Not surprisingly, the competition agent has upon price transparency. Plus, its guidelines is that information exchanges, there are a couple ways of safeguard some of the balances, both with respect to making price transparency historical, but also aggregating some of that information. Don't give just staggering. Let's say, give what is the average, how big is it? Some of the costs and benefits then depend on, well, what's the use of the information? And also, what's the supply side? What's the market structure for suppliers? How would they use it? And then, kind of related to this question, is a lot of the way you were characterizing slides of the trade-off was the trade-off of the benefits of information versus collusion. Something we're also talking about. Maybe appropriately said, it's not just collusion that we care about, but it's also how it changes, how competition works. It changes incentives of the market. Where that goes is if you're assessing what the danger of price transparency is, it isn't really just what is the effect of collusion, but instead what could the impact on incentives be? What's sometimes only referred to as softening competition, just what the incentives in essence related to most favored nations. And well, do I really want to offer a lower price if that's going to be impacting either next round or what other buyers do? Has nothing really to do with collusion. It's purely a unilateral effect on incentives.
Both great points. So this is work being done by the FTC or the Department of Justice. I mean, how does one look for?
I can give you the slides afterwards. There's a whole healthcare policies out there and a lot of related cases.
Yeah, I can't help but come back to the cost versus price transparency.
Sorry, could everybody introduce themselves briefly before questions?
I'm Xavier Towse. I'm with USAID, but I speak on my own my own. So without sounding like an activist, it sounds like the debate on price transparency versus cost transparency in the case of on-patent drugs. It's interesting how you put the onus on the buyer side when it comes to other goods. Transparency on cost is very much a driver on negotiations. So I would argue that a non-patent drug is different in terms of public good than the iPhone. So the iPhone is sold at a much higher price than the cost. But can you not make the argument that for a non-patent drug, it would be reasonable to explore at least cost transparency in order to inform the negotiations on procurement?
So I think I would expect a significant purchaser to be thinking about cost and to raise that in any negotiation discussion. So, but in a sense, how much do we gain by having if we could have lots of cost information? The difficult area is very much on what you do about global and then you get straight into trying to work out what it was when I take failures. Then what's my recovery here? So how much do I think that how much should a particular buyer contribute towards that? Are we in agreement about that? Of course, the answer we're not in that. So I think I want the purchaser to be informed and have as much information as possible about the nature and the cost structure that they're buying from. But they also need to have some understanding of what their budget is and what they're willing to spend. So it comes back to Unitel, what's your floor in terms of what you think it costs to put something on the shelf versus what's my maximum, at which point I just walk away and say, actually I can get better. All countries, particularly middle and low-income countries, there are other things they can do with their health dollars, and they will also deliver a lot of health gain. So if I can't get access to a particular intervention at a price that makes sense for my population, I spend my. So those trade-offs. So yes, a life-saving on-patent drug is iPhone. Question then is, if you want more of those in the future, we have to do R&D. So how do we do that? Who's going to pay for the R&D? So we get into all those sorts of issues. And if we don't have some sort of agreed international protocol, then we are talking about different bargaining arrangements around different parts of the world. In a sense, what I was trying to get at, amongst other things, is if you're a regional procurer or you're an individual healthcare system, how do you think about what you should be willing to pay for that drug? And does price transparency help you get a better deal? Trying to argue for balance, I think.
One thing I would like to add, Adrian, is that similar to your comment about the Cernuschi paper, which is only 3 or 4 countries systematically use that information, I think it's worth becoming more empiric about it, both on the issue of what do we know about cost. So are countries and purchasers effectively using Andrew Hill's cost of goods sold work in their price negotiation in some way? Yes, no. Is it 3 countries like the Cernuschi paper, or is it more? And are they able to use that in any way to get anything better? Similarly, I think on off-patent medicine prices, I mean, UNICEF Supply Division puts out their prices. for reproductive health and family planning products, we have prices which are available publicly. So it's not that they are not available, but are they really having an impact where purchasers using those prices are able to negotiate any better? I haven't come across any empiric evidence that tells us that. So that would be an area which I would want to see people comment on, or if they have insights on.
One comment online and 2 questions, and I'll just read them all. One very much builds on Prashant. There's a problem with the lack of empirical evidence.
Is this, yes. Okay. There's a problem with the lack of empirical evidence in the pharmaceutical market, of course, because there's no transparency in prices. The reality is that lower income countries often pay higher prices than higher income countries, including on patent products. Merging in the middle might be a good thing. It would be great if you could list the assumptions in your arguments included in the presentation. The follow-up question is, how do you think that competition authorities could enforce antitrust regulations in the absence of transparent prices? And the second question is, on your argument on the need to recoup R&D costs for on-patent medicines, how can this be done when there is no real transparency on R&D costs? Current R&D cost estimates vary tenfold, so surely we need true transparency of R&D costs before we can make assumptions on the impacts of transparency on medicines prices.
Yeah, those are all good challenges, and I suspect that we're probably not going to reach agreement on this. But let me sort of respond, make some comments on your very valid comments. I think critical points about low-income countries often pay higher prices. I think that in part reflects that if you don't have a local health or organised procurement within that low-income country, then typically what's going to happen is you've got an out-of-pocket market. Companies will focus on the high-income part of that, and therefore you can have prices that will be way above prices that may be paid by a middle-income country that has a healthcare system that has procurement arrangements which impact on prices. So I think we can't. So you're right, but I think the missing part is, what does that pharmaceutical market look like? Is there a healthcare system in place, and what mechanisms is it using in order to get some medicines for, particularly for the lowest income part of it? I take the point about competition authorities, but I mean, there's a difference here. Once the competition authorities decide to act, then they have powers of requiring disclosure, so they can get all the information on costs. Question is, would they need cost information in order to have concern about whether companies are abusing a dominant position? Again, we get into different competition law and rules in different jurisdictions. But my guess would be that typically what's happening is the buyers are complaining and the buyers are collecting evidence. So, and that then is sufficient to trigger various stages of investigation by various levels of compulsory disclosure from. So I think the competition authorities have enough powers. I think the point about R&D costs is a perfectly valid one, but we come back to I think we come back to 2 issues. So let's suppose you could track the cost of developing a particularly successful drug X. So you can work out, and the Marzi et al. Papers track those. But then you've got the problem of the earlier stage discovery programs, where you were, in a sense, you were covering a whole raft of areas, and then taking something out of there and putting it into development. And then you've got the difficult issue of failures. So you mentioned the tenfold differences, and the Prasad-Malinkovi paper, which comes out with one of the lower estimates, then there you've got an example of, I think, 10 companies, single drug companies, so you can see what their R&D costs are. And so you've got a sense of how much it costs them on average to develop a product. The problem is that's your survivor analysis. What you've not got in your equation is all the companies who took investor money and went bust and didn't develop a new drug. Because that's the cost of failure, which is somewhere else. So I think we have two issues on R&D costs. One is the practicalities of just assembling what is appropriate and relevant for a particular drug. But then the other part of it is, let's suppose we worked out those costs. We still have the issue of, well, how much should the US contribute to that R&D recovery? How much should Egypt? That's an easy one. That's zero. But how much should Brazil? How much should the UK? How much should Greece? So if we don't have agreement on who's going to pick up on the R&D costs, then we come back to a sort of a bargaining framework or a procurement arrangement by which healthcare systems either collaborate with each other or purchase. So they're all perfectly valid points that you raise. I don't think that's my side.
So I think there's someone over there, and then we'll come to you. Sorry.
Hi, my name is Lizna. I'm at the company called ThinkWell, which is a global health system strengthening organization. I have a couple of comments. A lot of these discussions, I feel like, are really focused on cost plus pricing, even though a lot of things have moved towards value-based pricing. So when you're talking about R&D costs, those are sunken costs, and those should not be taken into account into future pricing decisions. Is what I've learned in my pharmaceutical economics class. I could be wrong. So I'm just kind of curious, why are we talking so much about R&D cost here, which is a company's responsibility to recoup, not government's responsibility, and to think about it from that perspective. But the main idea is R&D costs are sunken costs. Another point I have is regarding your point on countries should move towards a willingness to pay thresholds. I'm curious about the UK example in this case, because you have NICE, which determines your willingness to pay thresholds for many different types of drugs. So I'm curious of how is it working in the UK when you have willingness to pay?
Well, I think I am arguing for value-based pricing as a focus on, from the payer's point of view, what am I getting from this? I think I was trying to argue that, and I think I was coming under criticism for not thinking more about costs. So you have a range. You've got costs at the bottom, at which point the supplier walks away, and then you've got value, and if the prices are above that, then the buyer walks away. So that's. But it does seem to me, if we want to reward R&D, then during that the period of intellectual protection, then the prices certainly in high countries need to be towards that willingness to pay level to keep. I think the particular issues with the UK and NICE and lots of debate around whether the willingness to pay threshold that NICE uses is appropriate. Some have argued it's too high. Other people have argued it's too low. So I've rather getting into that whole literature and approach at this point, I think what I'll say is more is just there's an example of a payer that is trying to understand or an agency acting on behalf of a payer, trying to come up with some estimate of what it thinks is reasonable to spend in terms of the health gain they're going to get and other things that the system can do with that money. And there's a whole separate round of debates as to whether it's got it right, whether we should be spending more on health and so on. But I think it's best used as an example of how an agency acting on behalf of the payer can organise itself and whether they've got the number right or not. Both an empirical, economic, and of course a policy question.
Thank you. I just wanted to make a comment, and that's particularly in countries in Latin America. Maybe the health system, in principle, is not willing to pay for an innovative medicine because of the cost, or because it doesn't have the information. But then what happens is that patients go and they sue the government, the public sector, they go to the courts basically to demand for the therapy, and then the government has to pay, at higher prices because it has to buy from the private market. And then, is when the government decides, okay, I'm going to sit down and negotiate with the manufacturers. So sometimes, those are common problems that we're seeing in countries that don't, are not really preparing itself to try to adapt innovation into their health system, because of course there's a price difference, but then you have then a very higher cost on having to deal with this judicialization. And the other thing I wanted to say is that with R&D, of course, is beyond R&D. For example, in the case of Merck, we have had Mectisan for river blindness, which is not a non-profitable medicine that we have given. There is the Ebola vaccines. So sometimes you're cross-subsidizing, the pricing of something that you're willing to give at no cost, right, with something that you have to recoup the cost. So if you're a for-profit company, then, you have to take these things in mind, right? This is not just about how much did it cost to do X drug, because there's a lot of cross-subsidization as well.
Other questions, comments?
Hi, this is Simon Canessa. I'm formerly with the Norwegian Refugee Council, no affiliation right now. So my comment is thinking on patent innovative medicines and countries that has age technology assessments like NICE in the UK. Normally, a medicine doesn't come completely along in a therapeutic category. And then there are an agency like NICE will look into what treatment works better for what type of patients, and then looking at the price, recommend whether it's advisable to use that medicine or not for what type of patients. I'm curious about whether having an agency like that is difficult, it's expensive to have the people that has the knowledge, access to all the information, and make the right decisions. And as you said, all comes down to putting a price for quality adjusted years that may be debatable. But my question is more, there are high-income countries that do not have this type of agencies, and they come to this decision in other ways. And I wonder if there is any type of study that compares how the outcomes in health for these different income countries that choose not to use health technology assessments change.
I'm not aware. There are studies of different types of HTA or pricing and reimbursement mechanisms, and how does the same drug get treated under different types of system. But I think the sort of macro analysis you're talking about would be, there's so many different things going on, it would be quite hard to adjust the data to try and isolate overall impacts on health from particular components of the system. So it's also very hard for me, as having been in health economics for 25 plus years, to concede that HTA is not useful. But that's a normative statement on my part rather than a positive. Yeah.
Okay, so we're almost out of time. Unless somebody has a burning question, a couple of concluding remarks, which is, so first of all, thank you to Adrian for coming and sharing this. I also want to highlight a couple of things. One is, this is a shameless self-plug for some of CGD's work. My colleague Calypso, Rachel Silverman, Carl Clarkson, and I have a new paper, which is value-based tier pricing, in which we get into how to think about tiered pricing, not from a manufacturer profit maximization design perspective, but more from the perspective of a health system value. So I encourage you to look at that, send us comments, critique, things, areas where you think we should improve that. The second is on this issue of what Adrian described as in many low and middle income countries where there is an off-patent generic product, but is sold at a higher price because branded generics brand is a signal for quality, and that constitutes higher price. So we are planning to organize a seminar, so stay tuned, which will look at what is the delta, or the difference in the willingness to pay for branded generics versus generics, and is that delta commensurate with the quality signal that the brand gives in places which have low regulatory enforcement, and what could be done to change that dynamic. So we'll have a seminar on that in the next few weeks. We'll send you out an invite. And to answer your question, I think at CGD we are continuing to think about this issue of price transparency, when it applies, when it doesn't apply, making sure that the right kind of evidence gets into the policy debate, whether it is at the World Health Organization or other forums, including many other discussions which are starting to happen. So yeah, this is an active area for CGD. With that, I want to thank Adrian once again for coming. And thank you to all of you.